Wildlife by Cynthia DeFelice, Chapter 13. When they were safely out of sight of the road and the farmhouse, Eric began to relax a little. He'd been so busy with his own thoughts that he hadn't been paying attention to what Quill was doing. Now he realized that Quill wasn't just ambling along in front of him. She was hunting. With her nose to the ground, she raced along until she caught an interesting scent that either halted her in her tracks for further investigation or sent her off in a new direction. Sometimes she stopped, lifted her head, sniffed the air, and chased after a scent borne by the breeze. Eric knew that his puny human nose was at least 1,000,000 times less discriminating than Quill's, which was why he had no idea what the tantalizing odors were that were riveting her attention. But he found it fascinating to watch her. She was running along the border between a brushy hedgerow and a field of wheat stubble. The grain had already been harvested, but a fair number of wheat kernels had been left behind on the ground. Suddenly, Quill's body became tense, her attention more focused. Her tail, which had been wagging happily, began to beat back and forth so quickly it was almost a blur. Then she made a quarter turn and slammed to an absolute standstill. Her gaze was fixed straight ahead at the hedgerow. Her tail stood out horizontal and motionless now, and her right paw was lifted as if she'd been asked to shake. She looked exactly like the etching on Dan's gun. Quill was on point. Eric was so entranced by her performance that for a full minute he just stood watching. Quill's concentration never wavered. Eric scanned the brush where the dog's gaze was pinned. For the life of him, he couldn't see anything but grass and browning weeds. Time stood still in the warm, quiet air. "What is it, girl?" he whispered. "Is something there?" He took a tentative step forward. Quill looked over at him for one split second, an expression on her face that seemed to say, "You smell that too, right? Are you ready?" And phew! In a flurry of wings, a pheasant rose into the air, cackling in outrage. It seemed to hang in the air for a moment, even if its rooster-like cry hadn't given it away as a male. Eric got a clear look at its long, trailing tail feathers and the gleam of green, red, and white on its head. It flew swiftly into the far distance and out of sight, leaving a single white dropping as a protest. Eric was so startled he nearly lost hold of his gun. He gasped and watched as the bird disappeared. Quill had flinched slightly and taken a few steps when the bird first took off, but now she was back on point. "It's gone, girl," said Eric when he had recovered from his surprise. Quill ignored him. "That was a great point, Quill, but the bird's gone. It flew away." Quill continued to stare into the hedgerow, her paw lifted and her entire body quivering. Eric moved closer to her, wondering if there was a command he was supposed to give her to release her. Hadn't she seen the bird fly? How long would she stay like this? What was she doing? "Quill," he began, and at that moment a hen pheasant, then 2, then 3, 7, 10 more, broke from the cover of the hedgerow. Smaller than the male, dull brown in color and silent except for the furious whir of their wing beats, they flew off in all directions. Eric's amazement was quickly followed by dismay. "Some hunter you are," he thought. "Your gun wasn't even loaded." Even if it had been, he'd been utterly unprepared when the birds had flown. Worse, he doubted Quill, who, unlike him, seemed to know exactly what she was doing. "I'm sorry, girl," he said, bending down to give her a pat. "From now on I promise I'll try to hold up my end. Beginning with," he grimaced to himself, "loading my gun." He put shells in the chamber and put the safety on, wishing he'd had a chance to go hunting even just once with Mr. Holt and Hot Spots in order to get a little experience. As it was, he would have to learn from Quill and the birds themselves. What had they just taught him? Quill had clearly been saying, "Watch me, stick with me. I'll tell you where the birds are." All Eric had to do was pay attention. It was almost as if the dog had performed a magic trick, conjuring pheasants out of thin air. Without Quill, Eric would have walked right by them, never suspecting they were there. As for the birds, the rooster had flown solo, before the hens. If that was usually the case, it was important information to know. Hunters were only allowed to shoot roosters, not hens. If the males were generally the ones to spook and fly first, he'd have to stay on his toes. He wondered what the birds had been doing when Quill pointed them. Had they been just hanging around in the hedgerow enjoying the nice day? Somehow Eric doubted it. He looked about in the wheat field and saw some more pheasant poop, as well as several tracks left in low spots where the earth was smooth and damp. Eric guessed they had been eating the grain that had been left behind on the ground. Since the wheat stubble was only about 4 inches high, they would be easy for a predator to spot. He figured that when they'd seen him and Quill approaching, they'd scuttled over to the hedgerow to hide. If he was right, it was another important piece of information. He'd remember to keep his eye out for fields like this one. Eric was about to move on when he realized he was hungry and thirsty. He didn't have a watch. Who needed a watch anyway? A pioneer boy would know how to tell time by the sun. But he thought he'd been walking for about 2 hours. He tipped the canteen up and let the water run down his parched throat. Quill watched him, her tongue hanging out, panting. He quickly poured the rest of the water into the lid of the mess kit, which doubled as a bowl, and she drank. When the water was gone, she looked up, still panting, thirstily. Earlier, he had seen her take a long drink from a medium-sized pothole. The water, which was brown with green algae around the edges, had looked disgusting to Eric, but Quill hadn't seemed to mind in the least. The pothole was far behind them, though, and he would need to find water for her, and for himself, too, pretty soon. He was going to have to plan ahead and boil water to fill his canteen each morning. That meant he was going to have to camp near water. Okay, good. That would be part of his plan from here on. He took the food from his pack and made 2 bologna and cheese sandwiches. Quill devoured hers in 2 seconds flat, but Eric took his time savoring the flavor, thinking that never before in his life had a bologna and cheese sandwich tasted quite so fine. He and Quill each had a cookie. Then Eric ate one of the apples. To his surprise, Quill eagerly chewed up the core. The food he had brought wasn't going to last long, though, not with 2 of them eating. They had enough for dinner that night and for breakfast and possibly lunch the next day. Very soon, he and Quill were going to have to find some more game, and he was going to have to shoot it. That made him wonder, when did he actually shoot something? Would someone hear the noise and come to investigate? Just as this new worry entered his mind, he heard the sound of a faraway gunshot, and then another, and another. He remembered Dr. Bob saying that the season was open for sharp-tailed grouse as well as pheasant. For all Eric knew, it was open season for deer, squirrels, rabbits, ducks, and geese, too. That meant other hunters would be shooting, not just him. People would be used to the sound, and probably wouldn't pay much attention. That was good, because he was going to be hunting illegally. He didn't have a North Dakota license. Well, there was nothing he could do about that. He and Quill had to eat, and anyway, he didn't intend to get caught. Chapter 14. When they came to their first paved road, Eric called Quill back to him and approached carefully. After making sure there was no sign of a vehicle coming from either direction, they crossed and moved quickly into the big field on the other side. Eric felt uncomfortably exposed in such open territory and kept an eye out, prepared to drop to the ground and lie flat if someone drove by. No one did. He didn't exactly know what time it was, but he didn't think Oma would even have gotten home from church. No one would be thinking of looking for him yet, but if and when people began searching, he didn't want anyone to remember seeing a boy and a brown and white speckled dog crossing this road or any other. If and when they looked for him, they'd have to look in all directions, and he and Quill had only gone in one. Also, he imagined if they did search for him, they'd likely assume that he'd gotten lost and wanted to be found. They wouldn't expect him to purposely be eluding them. As he and Quill traveled through the afternoon, Quill went on point 3 more times. Each time a group of birds flew, with the roosters flushing first and the hens holding a bit longer. Eric shot each time, blam, 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 emptying the chamber of all 5 shells, but hitting nothing. The first 2 times, Quill raced around, searching in all directions for the downed birds. When there were no birds for her to retrieve, she seemed confused. When no birds fell the 3rd time, either she glanced over her shoulder at Eric with mild reproof. "I'm sorry, girl," he said miserably. "It's not your fault." Real hunting was turning out to be quite a bit different from shooting clay targets, and he was just getting worried. Each box of shells held 25 cartridges, and he only had 4 boxes. He'd just shot off 15, and he had nothing to show for it. If he didn't improve his aim, and fast, he and Quill would be in big trouble. He had his wallet containing his allowance money, but he didn't want to risk going into a store. A sudden exhaustion overcame him. With it came a whisper of fear that he had made a huge mistake. The last thought made him even more disappointed in himself. What kind of wimp was he, anyway? He'd been out on his own for less than a day. Some pioneer. He tried to recall what advice Mr. Holt had given him when they'd been at the target range. Use your front hand to start the muzzle moving in the direction of the target. Then swing at the same time you bring the stock up and mount it near your face. When the bird is moving, you can't stop your swing to shoot at it. You have to come from behind the bird, swing your gun past it, and shoot ahead of it. That's what he had been doing wrong, he realized. He'd stopped his motion when he took his shots. What else had Mr. Holt said? Plan with your head, then shoot from your heart. Do your thinking before you pull the trigger. Your eyes will never lie to your hands. When he'd said that, Eric didn't get it. But now he thought maybe he did. He just had to relax and remember what he already knew. He'd do better next time. Squaring his shoulders, he shook off his trepidation. Quill, as if reading his mind, shook herself over too. Then she looked at him with an eager doggy grin and ran ahead. As far as she was concerned, the missed shots were forgotten and she was ready to move on. Eric couldn't help but grin back. Some of the confidence and excitement he'd felt upon starting out that morning returned to him. The next time he checked, the sun had moved far to the west. Although it still looked fairly high in the sky, Eric knew that when it started to drop, darkness would fall quickly. He was becoming seriously concerned about Quill. Her tongue lolled like a long, thick pink balloon, and she was panting heavily. Her pace, which hadn't wavered all day long, was slowing, and her rear legs looked wobbly. Her eager expression was gone, her eyes glazed. When Eric felt her nose, it was hot and dry. He was beginning to panic about finding water when they came over a rise and he saw a barn in the distance, with what looked like a fenced-in corral by its side. He headed toward it. A dirt drive led to the barn from a side road too far away for Eric to see. There was an old red gas pump, but the only vehicle in sight was a rusted-out truck with no tires. It seemed safe to approach. In the corral was an aluminum watering trough with a spigot above it. Eric went over to inspect it and couldn't believe his luck when the handle turned and rusty brown water poured out. After a while it began to clear. He took off his pack, filled the bowl-like lid of the mess kit, and set it on the ground for Quill. She drank greedily. He refilled the bowl 2 more times before she stopped and laid down, tongue dripping. She was still panting, but she already seemed much better. He gave her a quick hug before filling his canteen and taking a long drink himself. Thirst slacked. He took a look around. He could almost believe he was the only human being on Earth, certainly the only one for miles in any one direction. Although someone obviously owned the property, there were no animals in the barn or corral, and there seemed no reason for anybody to come out here tonight. He walked around to the far side of the barn and decided it was a good place to make camp. After spreading one of the large plastic bags on the ground, he unrolled a sleeping bag and tried to get Quill to lie on it while he collected wood for fire. But she refused to leave his side. She even picked up a stick and carried it, dropping it on that pile Eric collected, as if she knew what he was doing. He laughed, shaking his head and telling her for perhaps the 20th time that day what a good, smart dog she was. When the fire was going, he made 4 thin sandwiches with the rest of the bologna and cheese. Quill gulped hers down as before, but once again Eric took his time, watching as the flames licked at the wood and the sky grew dark. He was still hungry, but he told himself that tomorrow he would hunt successfully, then cook and eat his fill of the very first game dinner. All day he pushed from his mind any thoughts about what might be happening back at his grandparents' farmhouse, but they crowded in now that it was growing dark. Big Darrell was probably home, and Dr. Bob would have come for Quill by now. They would have no inkling that he had run away, but were undoubtedly concerned that he had gotten lost. He pictured Oma out in the yard, anxiously scanning the deepening shadows for a glimpse of him. He imagined her coming back inside, perhaps asking Big Darrell what to do. He saw Big Darrell sitting stone-faced in front of the snowy television screen, saying gruffly, "Boy'll come back when he's scared and hungry." "That's where you're wrong," thought Eric. A group of pheasants landed in the overgrown field to the east of them. Eric listened as they called to one another, gathering together for protection in the deep cover. Ducks and geese whistled and honked softly as they flew over on their way to seek their own refuge for the night. Eric pictured the change that was taking place all around him as the creatures of the day sought sleep, giving the prairie over to those that preferred the night time. Owls, deer, skunks, bats, raccoons, opossums, and an eerie call filled the darkness, a mix of yips and barks, ending in what almost sounded like the high-pitched scream of a person in pain. This call was followed by another, and another, and another. Then all the voices joined together in a chorus, "Yip, yip, brrr," before fading into silence. Coyotes. Thrilled, Eric felt the hairs of the back of his neck rise as Quill stood and looked about, whining fretfully. "It's okay, girl," Eric whispered. "Coyotes don't mess with dogs or people." After a long moment, he added, "I'm sure of that." Another moment, he murmured, "I'm pretty sure, anyway." Quill lay down beside him and curled up with her nose to her tail. Eric added sticks to the fire, breathing in its smoky tang, feeling its comforting warmth, watching as it hungrily devoured his offerings. From time to time he glanced upward, where stars were beginning to dot the sky in numbers he never saw back home. Quill let out a sigh and settled her head in Eric's lap. He stroked her head, his hands moving gently over her closed eyes. When there was nothing left of the fire but a few embers, he wriggled down into his sleeping bag and closed his eyes too. Quill snored lightly beside him, but Eric couldn't sleep. From time to time the coyotes howled, calling each other to hunt. Bats swooped overhead in erratic flight, chasing insects, their squeaky chirps barely audible. Over and over again an owl gave its mournful call. "Hoo, hoo, 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 hoo." Then it stopped, and in the sudden hush, Eric heard the whisper of wings beat, followed by a rustle in the grass and the squeak of a small rodent. The night was full of sounds and movements of other nocturnal creatures Eric could only guess at. There were times when the noises in the dark sounded awfully close. Sometimes it seemed that whatever was making them had to be very big, but Eric wasn't afraid, and it wasn't apprehension that kept him awake. He'd never quite felt so alive, and he didn't want to miss anything on this first night of his new life. A chill fell as the day's heat rose and disappeared into the clear, starry sky. Eric was profoundly grateful for the warmth of Quill's body and the comfort of her company. Alone out here, he might have been overwhelmed by the hugeness of the prairie. He might have felt defeated by his own smallness in the face of it. But with Quill, he felt anchored to the earth, part of it all. Stay tuned next time for Chapter 15.